So I'd like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work, and many of us at ANU, of course, do. And acknowledging that we live and work on their unceded lands. So today it's a real pleasure to have Laurent Doucet present to us. He's Professor of Anthropology and a member of the Centre for Research and Documentation on Oceania in France. And he's spent many years working with Indigenous groups in Australia, as well as societies in Vanuatu, and he's published on a wide range of topics, including ethnohistory, kinship, sorcery, social organisation, social transformations, as well as conceptions and issues of land tenure and intercultural relationships. And today he's going to talk to us about how useful the hunter-gatherer label is in explaining the diversification of Indigenous Australian societies. And actually, sorry, just before you start, Laurent, if I could just ask everybody to mute their microphones for the duration of the talk and then turn them on again in the question time, that would be great. So thank you so much, Laurent, for presenting today, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much for these words, and thank you for the invitation. Quite a challenge for an anthropologist to talk within an interdisciplinary audience, and certainly with great interest I have accepted this invitation. Before I start, I would just quickly like to pay tribute to Douglas White, who has passed away in the last few days. He has been a very important person in the anthropology of social networks, and through this has also contributed to reanalyzing the pragmatics of kinship and other domains, of course. So just maybe if you haven't read his work, it's time now to read it now that he's dead. Unfortunately, this often happens like that. So just a few words. Maybe I should try to share my screen. If you can't hear me well, my network is sometimes a bit fluctuating. So if you can't hear me well, just please say it to me, tell it, and so I will try to change the network. So the paper I'm giving today is kind of tailored to talk to other disciplines and not necessarily to anthropology as such. And in particular, I'm interested to talk to archaeology and historical linguistics in particular, but not limited to. Basically, the general assumption, there is a general assumption that there is some kind of unity among Australian societies. We all know that. And we know that this unity has been nourished by ethnographic records, ethnographies that directly or indirectly talk to each other, communicate to each other, and allow to elaborate a kind of academic network of hunter-gatherer specialists. And this unity has now also become a reality in Australia for in some sense, for largely recent historical and political reasons, at least to some extent. So, however, I would like to stress that the assumption of an Australian unity is largely based on a rather conservative conception of what hunter-gatherer societies are or are supposed to be, or in fact on again largely presumed characteristic of the so-called hunter-gatherer societies and what they are supposed to share. When we look at other domains, it can be ritual, it can be kinship, which are as important in my opinion as modes of adaptation and subsistence. We observe, in fact, a quite incredible diversity on the Australian continent, and not even a real form of specificity of Australian societies. My question is just, can we abandon the assumption of a unity of Australian society and through this rethink typologies, hunter-gatherer versus the others, in other terms than only modes of subsistence and presumed means of adaptation? And if we can, on what grounds these typologies could they be thought on? So I would like to humbly suggest an alternative, which I believe can be helpful, I hope so at least, to think the Australian continent, but possibly also beyond. And in this sort of typology, which I will propose, I will not try to define characteristics as such, but a space of tension, of movement between two extreme poles, which I will call open system for one and closed system for the other. These poles, I want to underline, directly derive from Australian ethnography, and are not simply theoretical constructs or conjectures. However, I also suggest we could possibly think these poles in the process of trying to reconstruct the social organization of societies of the distant past, as well as engage in interdisciplinary dialogue. So I just want to, before I start to share my screen, I want to make a last disclaimer, explaining that I will have to recall certain elementary points, which is like the hunter-gatherer definition as it is used, or as it has been used, which you all know, but I need to recall these elements in order to construct my argument. But I will also, there's also not enough time to go into all the technical details that allow me to construct the other kind of alternative typology of tension between poles that I want to propose. So please bear with me that there is a kind of tension between saying things everyone knows and saying things which I can't go enough into details with. So I will now try to share my screen. Which hopefully works. Okay. Can you see, can everyone see this?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I will not, I have already said several words on what the scope of this paper is. I just want to remind you about, I will come back to some of these points, that the hunter-gatherers versus other societies paradigm remains a kind of reference, explicit or implicit, in anthropology, and in particular in historic anthropology, but also in archaeology and in some other disciplines. And of course, the typology is based on economic or subsistence or strategies, or what Binford called modes of adaptations. The problem is it implies particular constituents, behaviors, and also correlations. And I will come back to these as well. One of the major architects of these correlations has, at least in France, been Alain Testa, who is a highly read anthropologist, passed away as well, by archaeologists, at least in Europe, who work on prehistoric European societies. The problem is also that this vision or this definition of these strong correlations between the hunter-gatherer label and certain social characteristics implies a vision of bounded groups, bounded societies, entities that exist and that attempt to reproduce themselves in time and space, biologically, socially, and culturally. And this kind of bounded society is usually associated to three, in the literature, in research, to three major domains, which is one which we can call transmission. That is, within bounded societies, there are segments in which belonging as well as knowledge, to some extent, and rights and duties are transmitted in a kind of linear or multilinear, doesn't really matter way. What is also associated is that these hunter-gatherer societies are supposedly organized around territorial entities, which some have called hordes, local groups, and you may all remember the disputes that were ongoing for a long time between, and that was started by Radcliffe Brown, so this is a long history, between whether local groups, hordes, are actually also clans, whether land-using groups are also land-loaning groups. Well, all these discussions and debates were ongoing, and to some extent are still here. Even though not explicit, but in fact they inform a lot of hunter-gatherer ethnography. I don't know if some of you have been recently to the Shacks conferences, which still exist. And these questions are still predominant among those people attending those conferences. And the third is also the assumption that, which is supposedly stemming from observation, that these segments that transmit from generation to generation rights and duties, belonging and knowledge are regrouped within a larger entity, which is a kind of political, cultural entity, which is usually called tribes. Okay. What I want to say, what I want to show or try to illustrate is that the hunter-gatherer concept, as I just presented it shortly, is not a really useful typology, at least anymore, because it has become a kind of dead end on the way we can think social transformations in the long term. And I want to ask whether we can actually move away from the only subsistence or adaptation question and move to more social dynamics, to concepts of more, to a kind of typology that takes into account, or a distinction that takes into account, social political strategies, dynamic strategies that may diverge depending on historical situations. So I also already said that I will, from the second half of the paper, try to propose the difference between what I call open systems, which, for lack of better words, I call also exploratory colonizing, with inclusive strategies, and closed systems with rather constituted territorial and social entities, which do, in fact, in some ways reflect the kind of classic hunter-gatherer type that is defined in classic anthropology. All right, so I must say that preliminary ideas on this kind of typology were published in a volume that came out in 2019 that I wrote with the regretted and late Georges Guy-Escuré, who passed away this year as well. Too many people passed away in recent months and years. Not from COVID, by the way, Guy-Escuré, but from cancer, doesn't it? And this book was translated very badly by the publisher himself into an English version. We had about 3 days to check the version. It was just impossible, and even the title of the book is wrong. I mean, we were attempting to re-engage in conjectures, something that functionalist anthropology has put aside as being bad science, and they have translated this as conjecture. And, well, anyway, the whole book is badly translated. But just to let you know that it's not completely original. The original ideas were in there, and I'm trying to go a bit further now with some other contributions. I will start with the domain of kinship, because this is the first domain in which I work, and also because this is where some dramatic differences and diversities on the Australian continent are made quite explicit. And for this, I need to recall some old and not so old suggestions and theories, which are, of course, Lévi-Strauss and Nick Allen's tetradic theory, both of which attempted to try to discuss the foundations of kinship in general, but with a very heavy accent on observed and described Australian kinship systems. So basically, restricted exchange in Lévi-Strauss is based on Australian ethnography, and generalized exchange is not, but as we know, there is generalized exchange, as Lévi-Strauss called it, in Australia, and it could also be applied there. Nick Allen's tetradic theory goes in the same vein. He tried to elaborate a model in which he thinks, or through which one can think human kinship in general, but he more explicitly also associated it to historical processes, in the sense that he believes his tetradic model reflects the original human kinship system, if you want, or the organization around kinship. So it's a historical as well as a theoretical model. In that sense, it goes a bit beyond Lévi-Strauss. What both these models and many others have in common is that they assume the existence of a society, a bounded society. This Nick Allen's tetradic model and Claude Lévi-Strauss's restricted or generalized exchange model don't work if we don't have something that is bounded, if you don't have something that is closed, enclosed in itself, and that reproduces itself through time and space, biologically as well as culturally, through what Durkheim, another old school, called mechanical solidarity. And basically what this turns out is a kind of chicken egg problem, because society to reproduce itself needs some kind of symmetric system, as Nick Allen and Lévi-Strauss advanced, but at the same time, it is this symmetric system that engages the possibility or creates the possibility to think society as a bounded system. So there's a kind of, in my opinion, a serious problem with these kind of approaches on kinship. Just to illustrate what the tetratic theory is, just 2 minutes. I don't go into the details, but basically for Nick Allen, who is has passed away very few years ago, is a three-step historical process in which we have an unstructured endogamy in a society. The society pre-exists for him, which is divided into a generational level or sociocentric levels usually, and then divides itself into sections, which then turn into a kind of section system as we find it in Australia, or other ways of engaging in symmetric exchange system. That is the basis of the problem is that kinship has something to do with symmetry, entities engaging with each other and exchanging with each other within a bounded entity. That's basically how kinship has been viewed. And the problem, however, is in particular for Australia, and we have tried to show this in the AUC OSCIN project, in which Patrick McConville and Harold Koch and many others have contributed, where we have kind of made as complete as possible survey of past and present kinship terminologies and kinship organizations and marital obligations or rules or pragmatics. The problem is that it is very difficult to create typologies for Australian kinship systems, and in that sense, for Australian societies. It is very difficult to find some sort of overarching unity, even though in the past many anthropologists have tried. Of course, Radcliffe Brown, the important work of Harold Scheffler, who has tried to put these different kinship systems, not as many as we have investigated during the OSCIN project. Harold Scheffler has contributed significantly to understand the dynamics and relationship between different Australian societies. And of course, more recently, what is for me the major typology, the most useful and significant one is that by Ian Keane with his general 7 types. Useful in particular because he related also to other social characteristics, not just kinship. And of course, Ian Keane was also in this AUC project. What is a bit a problem with all these typologies is the fact that none explain why that they should actually think a typology for Australian kinship systems. Why there should be some kind of historical or structural relationship between those different systems, and if yes, on what the reference this typology should be based on, other than just a geographical limit. In particular, in kinship systems, where the comparative approach is probably one of the major approaches. And this obviously touches on several major problems, which is that there is as much variation among Australian kinship systems as there is between Australians and non-Australian kinship systems. And there's not even an Australian specificity. Even section systems, which are often thought to be an Australian specificity, are not limited to Australia. They've been found in some parts of ancient China, in some societies of South America, and we know that they are very recent on the Australian continent, not more than 2,000 to 3,000 years, most probably. The only kind of shared unity that we can find among all kinship systems is what we call bifurcation. That is, children of a brother and of a sister are different in one way or another. Now, this is probably something that is common to all at least most kinship systems, human kinship systems. This is not a specificity of Australia, of the Australian continent as such. Why does it move forwards? Oh. So the reason why this is also things you know, but the reason why people have continued to attempt to create relationships between Australian kinship systems, despite the absence of specificity and despite the large, significant diversity of Australian kinship systems and societies, are probably based, and you all know this, on two kind of big scientific paradigms, which again have kind of disappeared in the public debate, but in fact which remain hidden behind the scene or latent, do latently inform research and publications. These two theories can be summarized as kind of the isolation theories on one hand, that is isolation of the Australian continent from other societies and who have different kinship systems, different constituents, different modes of subsistence, adaptation, and so on. And we all know this to be obviously wrong. There are many projects, ongoing projects on the exchanges and relationships between Australian societies and non-Australian societies, PNG, Austronesians, Macassans, and so on. So, but this kind of isolation theory remains one of the hidden paradigm that allows us to continue to say, well, we need to find some kind of relationship between Australian kinship systems because they are amongst each other. But this isolation theory also works with what I already said, that is with the idea that these hunter-gatherer societies, even as hunter-gatherers, are kind of bounded units which reproduce themselves in themselves over time and are thus less prone, in a sense, to change or to adaptation of the social organization to particular historical or political strategies and so on. So there's a kind of fallacy of the fallacy of an equation between society and culture, in a sense, in Australia, that kind of stimulates the ongoing research on the relationship between the differences rather than the similarities of Australian kinship systems. This has also been recognized by archaeologists, for example, Martin Wobbs, who was talking very early on, 1978, imagined, but no one seems to have listened to him, that there's a proper tyranny, a kind of tyranny of the ethnographic record. That is, the hunter-gatherer concept has itself produced the ethnographic, has been produced through the ethnographic present, and the hunter-gatherer idea has been crystallized through particular ethnographies that kind of talk to each other with certain concepts and certain kinds of observations, stressing certain points, while not engaging in ways in which certain hunter-gatherers were in fact could not be considered as societies as the traditional anthropological theory at that time did think of them. And the other is, of course, the conservation theory. Many of those have published on this. Can't quote all of them, of course, but the conservation theory is kind of a latent, sometimes explicit idea that, well, hunter-gatherers illustrate how human prehistory in general has been, the way that human societies of the past have been. And of course, from Durkheim to Testa, or even Salins in his Société d'Abondance, I don't know how this was translated, what the original title was. I think, well, doesn't matter. You know which one I'm talking about. So there's all of those kind of stimulate or presume that there's a difference in nature and not simply a difference of degree between hunter-gatherer and non-hunter-gatherer societies. And the difference of nature in nature does stimulate to compare hunter-gatherers amongst them rather than compare hunter-gatherers with other kind of societies. Of course, these are very general statements I'm making. There's many exceptions, but in general, I think I'm not completely wrong about the way things have been done. Now, just quickly to recall the hunter-gatherer concept so that we talk, so that you understand that we talk about the same thing. It has, of course, it's an old concept, but it has kind of been crystallized very strongly in the cultural ecology movement, and in France very strongly by Alain Testa. I've already said a few words about him. And the general idea is that it expresses means and modes of adaptation to niche environments, to niches, ecological niches, which has consequences on the way, depending on the technological level, depending on the way social organization is, the social is organized in a sense. So the adaptation has consequences on how we conceive the rest of society. And hunter-gatherer societies are classically characterized as having, as not practicing any domestication, not practicing conservation or stocking food, by nomadism, by the existence of small local groups, by a very low demographic density with that useless concept of carrying capacity. They are thought of as having a distributed social organizations and hordes and local groups, as being rather acephalous, as being based on the sexual division of labor and not a social division of labor, and as having, which is important for archaeologists, a very weak technical or material imprint on the environment. So this is kind of the basic idea that lies behind the hunter-gatherer concept. And of course, these concepts or these definitions are then tied to what Julian called the multilinear evolution, that is, depending on seasonality. This is in particular the case with Alain Testa. I'm not going to criticize Alain Testa now, but no time. But the seasonality of resources will trigger or not certain changes in these characteristics, and will, as a consequence, trigger the emergence of economic, social, political inequalities, intensification, or what we call the Neolithic revolution will happen depending on seasonality according to this model, on the seasonality, the seasonal availability of certain resources or not. All right. The problem is, of course, and many anthropologists have, not all anthropologists, many important anthropologists criticize this model strongly and heavily. For me, one of the first and most important is Bertrand Arcan. I'm not sure this paper has number 3 in the bibliography, you can see. I'm not sure if this has been actually translated, which is a very important paper because he has been working among South American highlands hunter-gatherer societies, and has very early on said, well, this hunter-gatherer concept is just flawed. It just doesn't work because it doesn't reflect proper ethnographic records. We know that this is the case with many, and he was in particular working on nomadism. I said, oh, nomadism is not a characteristic of hunter-gatherer societies and cannot be used as a way of characterizing societies as being hunter-gatherers or not. This is, of course, also the case with many other domains, such as domestication of plants or animals. We know that there is domestication among all hunter-gatherer societies in one way or another. In the Western Desert, where I have spent most of my ethnographic fieldwork, people quite regularly saw white millet soup, so white millet in places where they think it should grow where there's none left, or so they harvest millet and then they resaw it, or replant a tuber of yam. They don't take the entire tuber, but replant a part of a tuber of yam. So is that hunter-gatherer or is that horticulture? Well, some have suggested to call it dommiculture. I think even in this domain, there is it's very difficult to kind of trancher, we say in French, to decide on which side of the limit these social practices actually lie. And we also know that most, if not all, hunter-gatherer societies have no modes of conservation with dehydration, congelation, fermentation, salting, and so on. Of course, not always for a very long period, but it does exist even in prehistoric societies, prehistoric hunter-gatherer societies, as Soulian has shown in a rather recent paper. And again, nomadism is a very difficult to evaluate. It's a very difficult characteristic to define, to use, to distinguish hunter-gatherer societies from, and I will come back to that, from non-hunter-gatherer societies. Here, just a few figures very quickly. If you count, if you see in the literature, the kind of typical residential moves for certain societies, you can see a huge difference, you know, between the Ainu, which are hunter-gatherers, and Baffinland Inuits. I mean, can we use nomadism or the number of residential moves as a kind of way to distinguish hunter-gatherer societies from non-hunter-gatherer societies? And all societies do hunt in a sense and do forage in a way or another. So just to illustrate also with demographic density that we see Bactaman in PNG, for example, have a higher demographic density as the Yingali in northern Australia. It simply cannot be used as a specific way to distinguish hunter-gatherers from non-hunter-gatherers. And there are also suspects for reverse changes, contra Neolithic revolution in a sense. For example, Iman who have been studied by Don Gardner, he explains, he shows in very nice papers that at 1,500 meters of altitude, these people are horticulturists, and moving down to the plain, they are hunter-gatherers. So, or they have become hunter-gatherers again. And there are also suspects in Borneo, in Sumatra, and also in North America about possible moves from horticultural, so-called horticultural societies to hunter-gatherer, back. Using the word back is actually, I shouldn't be using it, but I still use it because it's a dominant model, back to hunting and gathering. Of course, there's probably a lot of discussions about, in particular about with the proto-Algonquian, but and some people will reject the possibility of a reverse evolution in a sense or change. But I mean, there are suspects in that. So the problem I had with that, with this model, when I did my field work, and I did most of my field work in Australia, in the Australian Western Desert, is that these people clearly are kind of textbook hunter-gatherers. They walk a lot. They have no permanent residence. There's very little conservation activity, food conservation activity. There was, of course, I'm talking in the past now. They are very acephalous. Division of labor, with the exception, of course, of the medicine man or the shaman, if you want, is a sexual division of labor. So they kind of fit perfectly well within the hunter-gatherer ID, paradigm, tyranny, I would like to say. However, they don't fit with the rest of the model, or what is implied with these hunter-gatherer definition. That is, they have no clan or lineages. Then there are no corporate groups that transmit from generation to generation belonging, rights, duties. There is no collective appropriation of land. You cannot, there's no group, no collectivity in a sense that collectively says, well, this is our land, basically. This, of course, people will feel that they have privileges to certain sites, to certain areas, usually sites, not areas, but they would not be able to actually express this in a public space. They would not be allowed to actually, or they would be immediately interrupted. It would be very impolite to actually claim some kind of familial, that is a group ownership of certain sites, an exclusive kind of group ownership. And this also, this is the consequence of it. There's no strict prohibition. There's no way to actually disallow others to access the resources that stand on the land on which people live. This is the famous, you can read the famous paper by Fred Myers, which is always ask. Typical for Western Desert, you have to ask to access the resources of other people, but they won't be able to say no. This would be extremely impolite and would be immediately followed by social sanctions. There's no local groups as such, not at least in the ways in which it was defined by classic anthropology, but very small nuclear family groups who sometimes have an elderly person with them or an adopted child but they don't live in kind of local groups. They don't live in hordes, as Radcliffe Brown or even Howard called it in former times. There's no specific territorial boundaries in a sense. So there's no way to say, well, it goes from this tree to this tree, that belongs to me. There is no social imperative to kind of put boundaries on the land. And there's no political entity. There is no tribe as it was defined in classic anthropology. Again, the notion of tribe, they didn't have collective name. This is a consequence of the colonial encounter, of the necessity to make censuses and for people to be settled down. So they had to actually engage with the idea of tribe and think of themselves as a political and thus also a social cultural entity. In rather recent history, there's also no collective totems, which are totems are very significant social characteristics in Australia that allow to kind of understand how rights and duties are transmitted or appropriated, and there are no collective totems. And of course, there's no exchange of women, there's no exchange of men, there is no symmetric kinship system. So what are these hunter-gatherers who look like hunter-gatherers but have absolutely none of those characteristics that are usually the consequence of this hunter-gatherer model? In the Western Desert, and we will see it is not limited to the Western Desert, that is what interests me, people have individual totems. That is, totems that they are the production, the produce, the produit of an individual relationship of themselves with their place of birth and the history of that place of birth. That is the mythical history of that place of birth. And appropriation of land and resources is, for these people, a question of individual events, of personal experiences. That is, if I have lived long enough in a certain area, I can legitimately claim to be that person to whom other people may have to ask to access, even though I will not be able to say no. And there's no sense of a kind of an era of belonging or an era of ownership of land, but there is a very strong association to individual sites in which people have had individual experiences or experiences by their very close relatives. And another important characteristic in the Western Desert, which may interest archaeologists and which Richard Gould has shown a long time ago, is that there is a lot of exotic material. And the most important aspects or the most important mythical ritual elements in these societies are exotic material, are not endemic material, but are in fact exotic material. The most important difference to what we would expect of the hunter-gatherer mode of being, and the most important difference also to the predominant kind of idea of what kinship systems are in Australia, is the fact that there is absolutely no symmetry, in the sense that there is a prohibition to marry close and repetitive, close people and to engage in repetitive marriages. In my genealogies, for example, which go back about 150 years, there is absolutely no marriage between a sister and a brother into the same kind of family group. Even if a woman marries into one family, a distant family, with whom no genealogical memory must exist, then the brother will not be able to marry into this group, because these people have become brothers and sisters through the marriage of the sister. So this creates a very extensive, very dense and wide social networks of people who relate in multiple ways to each other, sometimes very distant in geographical terms, 2,000-3,000 kilometers, if possible, outside even of the dialectal groups, of the Western dialectal groups as an entity, many marriages to Walpri people, to Arundic people, and so on. So a very widespread genealogy, a more horizontal genealogy, rather than a kind of historical genealogy which reproduces itself through symmetric exchanges between clans and lineages over time. And this kind of kinship system, if you want, this kind of marriage practices, this kind of extreme exogamy, produces significant problem for the observer, which I am, to understand, well, where is society? What are the limits of these people? Where does the Western desert stop and where does it start? And the only, which is a stupid conclusion one comes, but this is actually a conclusion made from observation, is that, well, the Western desert ends where other people don't want to exchange with them anymore. That is, the others actually set the limits of where Western desert groups' existence has a limit. Okay. Now, very intrigued by this fact, or intrigued by this, which is in a sense a problem for hunter-gatherer anthropologists. Such, the OSCIN research project has helped, contributed to actually look, well, what is that? Is the Western groups, the desert group, the only kind of area where this appears, this happens? In this case, we would unfortunately fall back down to Binford's adaptive model in a sense. Well, the Western desert is the harshest environment ever inhabited by human beings before the Industrial Revolution. So it is a way of, it's a kind of so marrying distant places and having strong prohibitions of incest and elaborating all the time on the prohibition of incest, as these people do, is a way of adapting kind of social security due to the extremely harsh environment. But in fact, if we look at the main characteristics these kinship systems have in the Western desert, and we compare it with other societies, we see that there are many other Australian groups, some in desert areas, others in non-desert areas, who have very similar systems, and in which case we would have to reconsider the ethnographies, the old ethnographies that have been made with these people, and wonder whether these ethnographies were not too much influenced by the hunter-gatherer concept itself. And we can see, I have listed here a few, some of which, in addition to all the Western desert groups, who have other languages or other language groups which have very similar characteristics, such as the neutralization of cross-cousin siblings and parallel cousins. I won't go into the detail, but basically when you neutralize cross-cousin siblings and parallel cousins, you're actually reclassifying cross-cousins, which are in Australia considered the ideal spouse, erroneously, into brothers and sisters, meaning that you can't actually marry your cross-cousins, meaning that you have to marry outside people with whom you could engage in symmetrical exchanges, which is, you actually destroy the potential for symmetry, and destroying the potential for symmetry, you destroy the idea of a bounded society that reproduces itself through itself over time. And you have other languages have very explicit rules, in addition, very explicit rules according to ethnography on non-repetitive marriages. That is, you can't marry into the same family your parents married, or your sister or brother married, and so on. I won't go into the details, but you can see it's Western desert is not an exception. It's often an exception, and Lévi-Strauss even called them anomalous because they didn't fit his model. But there are actually many other societies that kind of go in that way, or that have important aspects that do push us to reconsider the closed hunter-gatherer kind of model of society. So because of this problem, I've thought of kind of regrouping these different or rethinking this landscape in different ways, and completely forgetting the hunter-gatherers idea, and forgetting about subsistence and habitation, and trying to see, well, what other social characteristics, or what other characteristics that can be linked to this kind of very expansive way, social political strategy, which is illustrated through the marriage practice. And I've kind of, for lack of better ideas, thought it should be, we could think of the Australian landscape as being a kind of continuous chain of tension between, on the one hand, what I call open systems, that is what I call also unsettled, in a sense, unsettled societies with a very different territorial affiliation as the closed systems, and on the other hand, the closed system. The way I look at the open system is a kind of is through non-bounded reproductive strategies. That is the social reproductive strategies. That is, people don't engage in exchanges which will reproduce the identity. Is there a problem, or because I can hear someone? No? Okay.
I think it's okay.
So, sorry.
I think it's okay.
Okay. Okay. So, which the Western Desert is very close to that open system, to the very extreme aspect of the way people engage in reproductive strategies. When I say reproductive strategies, I don't mean just biological or sexual reproduction. I mean the reproduction of culture, if you want, or of society, of access to land, of techniques, of rights and duties, and so on. So a non-bounded way of reproducing themselves in time and space, in what I also like to call a kind of exploratory mode. And we have a lot of, Peter Stratton has published several papers on this. We have a lot of testimony of how Western Desert people continuously attempted in the past to engage with, even sometimes through war, with their neighbors, and kind of occupy their land, or engage in exchanges with them, so to actually co-occupy the land with them. And societies in which individual experience, agencies, competence, individual competence is a major element in the way people think of themselves. And this also leads to a kind of networked, more networked social organization, rather than a kind of bounded and hereditary social organization. And on the other hand, we have other examples. For example, the Walpri are close to that, but not completely, of course. They, in my opinion, also have some elements of the open system, which are bounded, which are called closed systems, and which are bounded, which have bounded reproductive strategies. That is, their social organization is based on, or has segments within it that it continuously exchange. Not exclusively, there's also exogamy, of course, but continuously exchange not just people, not just marry between clans, but also exchange knowledge, rights, what it means to belong to a certain society or culture, if you want, and so on. And I call this a more kind of settled mode, where the territorial affiliation is completely different, is very different, and very much more zone-based, very much more reproduced-based, and very much more symmetrical than it is with open systems. And I was then wondering, looking at these variations, whether we could think other societies in different times and eras in these same terms. And when we look at ethnography and kind of tend to push certain societies rather to the closed system or more to the open system, there are certain characteristics that seem to go together with this extreme way of networked exogamy, or on the other hand, with the clan-based reproductive strategies over time. I won't go with all the details since it is recorded. You can maybe read it later, but because I think soon over time. Yes, my God. So the kind of this kind of way of thinking the access to land and the appropriation of land and the relationship with others, which are in open system inter-individual relationships, while in closed systems they're more inter-group relationships, seems to be correlated with many other social characteristics, such as the existence of totemic, of group corporate totems in closed systems, the idea of, in terminology, of classificatory terms rather than descriptive terms as in open systems, the predominance of kind of language endogamy in closed systems, while there is a predominance of a language exogamy or dialect exogamy in open systems and so on. So it kind of goes with many other characteristics into which I don't want to go, which kind of tend to separate these kinds of, shouldn't be using societies now, because I think the word societies should be limited to closed systems and not be applied to open systems. Here again, because I think I'm over time, I won't go into the detail, but they are significant. We can also evaluate or identify closed and open systems in looking at the ways in which people, the number of people or the number of relationships people engage with through kinship, and in open systems, it is clearly exponential compared to closed systems. I don't go into the technical details, but it has, it just illustrates that these societies with a tendency towards open systems are societies that are clearly not only migratory in geographical terms, but actually are socially inclusive, attempt to actually engage with the other, so to become like the other, or to actually turn the other into oneself, compared to other. Now, what are the consequences for archaeology, genetics, and linguistics if this kind of bipolarization of Australian societies has any sense? And in open system, what I call open system, we would expect in the long term repetitive, periodic or repetitive genetic admixtures because of the wide network these people would engage through their social system. We would, as I already said, we should be able to find exotic material, a lot of exotic material because of these exchange systems. And we would find campsites, in particular on ecotones, particularly ecotones, where these exchanges take place, but we would have very few permanent sites. This is also ethnographic reconstructed from the Western Desert itself. And we would have, this is wrong, open system, we do not have immersion of distinct languages. You need to skip those two. This is wrong. This should be on this side. In open system, you would have the continuity or with certain diversification of dialects. In closed system, we would have a crystallization of distinct languages. And we would have the emergence of regional styles, which is not the case in open systems, and is not the case neither in the Western Desert nor in those other cases I have. So this as a kind of conclusion, because I'm already over time. Sorry, I had to skip a few points, but I think I had 45 minutes. I'm over it already. When I read O'Connell's, James and Allen's The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, and when they described the kind of first moves, what they think was the constitution of the societies that first moved into PNG and into Australia, I had the impression that I actually read a reconstructed ethnography of an open system, or of the Western Desert, or of the Central Eastern Desert, if you want, with very rapid, frequent movements, very small groups, the importance of zones of encounter, places of encounter, and the exchange, continuous exchange between parallel moving groups in parallel moving groups, very different to what you can read in Meggett's ethnography of the Worldprix, for example. And interestingly, archaeologists also demonstrate or show that about 20,000 years ago, regional styles emerge. And if my idea of open and closed systems and the tensions that exist between them has some kind of validity, then this would also mean that 20,000 years ago, there would be, with the emergence of regional styles, there would be a kind of transformation of some of the open systems into more closed and symmetric systems reproducing themselves over time and space, and thus an increasing equation between society and culture, which is not the case in the open systems nor in the Western Desert. So I will stop here. I hope this was a bit quick and has to go over several things. But I hope my kind of main point still remained comprehensible. Thank you.